Good afternoon. I am Cindy Penrose, COO of the Paul Ramsay Foundation and Chair of the Justice Impact Area. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to Wiimpatja Place today. I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people being the traditional custodians of the land in and around Sydney Harbour, and I acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. I would also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues of mine who are in the room and also guests here today. Today is really exciting. It's the first of a series of events that we'll be hosting for our partners in the justice sector and an opportunity for us to come together to share ideas, connect to each other and inspire each other. And the last bit we're really relying on you for. Today's topic is justice advocacy, advocacy being critical to systems change. The effectiveness of realising our basic human rights, keeping young people out of the justice system and surrounding them with the conditions to enable them to thrive. This is all of our responsibilities, and I call upon each of you today as esteemed leaders in this justice space and the community leaders that you are to share what you have achieved, to discuss with us what you still hope to achieve, to talk about your ideas on how we can work together for that collective impact and for our collective aims, and to ensure that we work together to enable the young people of Australia, the most vulnerable and often forgotten young people in these communities, to really thrive in their future. Today's event will be a panel session led by Erin Goff, Senior Associate at Paul Ramsay Foundation, followed by lunch and then an audience Q&A. Can I invite Erin Goff, Senior Associate at the Paul Ramsay Foundation, to welcome our panellists and to discuss how today's proceedings will run. And before I do, Erin, can I just also acknowledge a couple of people in the room? Particularly, it's important to the Paul Ramsay Foundation to show, to have our support from our directors. Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time. Catherine Greiner here to see you today. It's very useful that you connect with the people in the community that work with us for the beneficiaries that we aim to serve. So thank you so much for being here. Equally, I would like to acknowledge the coroner who's also here today. Thank you so much for taking the time to come as well. Erin, please.
Thank you, Cindy, and welcome everyone to our panel event today, where after lunch we will be discussing the key issues, the opportunities and the priorities in justice advocacy for the year ahead. Now, it's safe to say that the landscape for this work looks different now than it did this time last year. In the last 12 months, we have seen a number of wins in the area of justice, and it's important to acknowledge those wins. There has been a reduction in prison numbers across Australia in the last 12 months. There have been some significant investments into alternative diversionary processes. We've seen growing momentum towards the raising the age of criminal responsibility across the country. More opportunities have been created for First Nations people to be more involved and have a greater say in justice outcomes. Through the exceptional leadership of First Nations people to build on the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a commitment to a referendum for a First Nations voice to Parliament has been secured, and in fact the legislation is being introduced today. Indeed, a new Commonwealth government and very recently in New South Wales, a new state government provide new opportunities for reform. On the other hand, we continue to see knee-jerk responses around bail law in particular. We saw heavy-handed COVID policing during lockdowns, especially in remote communities. Prisons are still being built around the country, and the existing ones are doing irrevocable harm to generations of Australians. There is still a lot to be done. For all of us working in the sector, the challenges of fighting for progress can seem endless and cyclical. No sooner have you achieved a procedural or legal reform than the reform is dismantled. No sooner has a window of opportunity opened that it closes. In this work, one is required to be tireless agile, creative and collaborative. And we are lucky enough to have 3 such people on our panel today. We were hoping to have Maggie Munn from Change the Record joining us, but they are a late apology. However, we have a terrific lineup of experts in Mindy Sotiri, Ivan Clarke and Jonathon Hunyor. Dr. Mindy Sotiri is the Executive Director of the Justice Reform Initiative. Mindy has worked in the criminal justice system as an advocate, community sector practitioner, activist, academic and researcher for more than 25 years. Her focus has been on advocacy around decarceration and building sustainable community-based and community-led pathways outside of prison settings. At the Justice Reform Initiative, they work on reducing incarceration throughout Australia and building communities where disadvantage is no longer met with a criminal justice system response. We at the Paul Ramsay Foundation are very proud to partner with JRI in this work. Ivan Clarke is a Barkinji Muligapa man, Director of the Wiimpatja Skills Development and Consultancy. Ivan has many years of experience as a counsellor, clinical and educational consultant, and was instrumental in setting up the counselling service for Link Up New South Wales, specialising in supporting stolen generation clients to re-engage with their culture and identity. He has previously worked in alcohol and other drugs with the WHO's programs. WHO's stands for We Help Ourselves in Sydney, the Foundation House and the Salvation Army Foster House. Jonathon Hunyor is the CEO of the Public Interest Advocacy Centre. Jonathon has practiced as a lawyer in New South Wales and the Northern Territory for over 25 years in areas including criminal law, discrimination and human rights, migration and refugee law, and Aboriginal land rights. He has previously worked as the Principal Legal Officer at the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency in Darwin and Director of Legal Services at the Australian Human Rights Commission in Sydney. PRF proudly supports the Raise the Age campaign work that PAC is currently embarking on. We will now take some time for lunch before we invite our panellists to the stage and begin our discussion. Please enjoy and we'll see you shortly. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Once again, it's very exciting to have this discussion today. It feels very timely for a number of reasons. Perhaps I can start, Mindy, with you. As the Executive Director of a national justice advocacy organisation, how do you see the state of play in March 2023?
Thank you. It's good to start with a small question just to ease our way into the thing. Look, I guess, so firstly, I'd also just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Gadigal land and pay my respects to Elders past and present, and acknowledge also First Nations leaders in this room who have actually been doing the heavy lifting in terms of justice advocacy really for the last few decades. I suppose we're here because we know there's a broken system. We know that things aren't working. That's why most of us are working in this space. If we take a little snapshot of what's happening in Australia at the moment, we can see there's about 43,000 people locked up in prisons around Australia. There's about 800 kids locked up in children's prisons around Australia. But actually the flow-through numbers are much more telling in terms of the numbers of people that are coming in. So in the adults, we know there's sort of 63,000 people coming out of prison every year. And with the kids, there's about 8,000 or 8,500 kids coming out of prison every year. So those are the numbers that we sort of need to be thinking of. There's about 118 prisons around Australia, 18 children's prisons, and in almost every state and territory there are blueprints, business cases, plans for building new prisons, some further along than others. And of course we're spending, billions of dollars, about $6 billion on the adults and $1 billion on the kids each year. And we know, of course, it's not working. So that's why we do the work, because we need to stop that. In terms of advocacy and in terms of looking at policy shifts and things that are going well and things that are not going well, I guess that the Justice Reform Initiative is, we get to sort of travel around a bit and look at what is happening in different places. I think that we can, as you noted, be cautiously optimistic that we are seeing a reduction overall in Australia in terms of the numbers of people that are going to prison. And that's with both the adults and the kids, and there's a couple of exceptional jurisdictions that I'll talk to, I'm sure, as we go through. But overall, the trend is that we're seeing things go down. That's primarily post-COVID, so most of that shift has happened sort of around 2018, 2019 is when we hit the peak around Australia, and then we've seen this shift since then. But what I'm hopeful about is that perhaps this might be part of a trend, and my job is to make sure that this is a trend so that we keep on seeing that downward trajectory. And I can talk about why I think that's happened as well. But in amongst all of that, it is really critical, I think, to note that there are some jurisdictions, including Queensland, including WA, and including the Northern Territory, where that trend in some areas is going in a different direction completely. So Queensland especially, we're seeing significant increases in children in prison. There's a proposal for two new kids' prisons, and we're seeing incredibly regressive law and order politics. There are a couple of jurisdictions, New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT, where we have had a number of elections now which have not been based on law and order politics, and we're seeing some of the advocacy work around promoting an evidence-based approach to justice policy, I think, really starting to take hold. And I guess that, I don't want to keep talking for too long, so I'll shut up soon, but I think that one of the big challenges that we have is trying to encourage those jurisdictions that are still clinging very hard to this particular mode of policy making to actually shift gears. In New South Wales, we are seeing significant reductions in both the law and order rhetoric and also in the numbers of people in prison, similarly in Victoria, similarly in the ACT. South Australia sort of is quite stable, although there's a business case for a new prison. But the jurisdictions that require an enormous amount of work and that require, I think, a lot of community sort of education in terms of the failure of incarceration, but also real listening in terms of what it does feel like to live in communities where there are high rates of crime, and thinking very clearly about what those alternatives might be. Those are the places that I guess if we're wanting to see nationally a reduction, that we need to be focusing a fair bit of energy.
Thank you, Mindy. That's so interesting and such a great overview. And I was thinking, about seeking your views on that highly politicised state, because we are seeing that in a number of jurisdictions at the moment where these issues are highly politicised. Not necessarily, in the lead up to an election, but just in terms of what's happening. Significantly backward moves are being made, in relation to bail law, and that's occurred in a couple of states over the last 12 months or 12 to 18 months. What is the approach of an organisation like yours when there is such a heightened political state? How do you see a way through?
So the strategy, I guess, of the Justice Reform Initiative, there's 4 strategies. One is around that political advocacy, and for us at the moment that means having many quiet conversations with parliamentarians and really trying to get a read of the room in terms of where the levers for change are sort of in politics. The other really critical part is around changing the public conversation, and that means really talking to people and engaging with people that have not historically been part of this advocacy. So business chambers, civil society, we do a lot of country women's associations, Rotary clubs, talking with people that have often had almost no contact with the justice system, that don't know how bad things are, that don't know how much harm it causes, don't know how expensive it is, don't know that it's not working to do the things that the community thinks that it is. So part of encouraging political bravery, and what we're saying to political leaders is, we know that this is a tough gig, right? We know that this has historically been in some jurisdictions where votes are won and votes are lost. But we also know that, that it's terrible policy, it's really expensive and it serves actually nobody, and it's obviously incredibly harmful, especially for First Nations communities. So having those conversations sort of quietly and then doing this kind of outward-facing work, which is around obviously getting sort of our voices and alternative options in newspapers, but also at a much more grassroots level, really having conversations with people, including, again, in communities where there are high rates of crime and there is genuine fear around community safety. And I guess finally, the message for us and what we're saying, both in our meetings with members of Parliament and with the other decision makers and with members of the community, is that we know, the research is incredibly clear. So if we want to think about what the evidence shows us, we know without a doubt that prison doesn't work to make a safer community. We only have to look at the recidivism rates to know, obviously, it doesn't work in terms of reducing reoffending. We know that the threat of harsher penalties like harsher bail laws or longer sentences or mandatory sentencing, we know, again, the research is really clear, that does nothing in terms of changing people's behaviours, in terms of whether or not they're going to commit crime. And I guess that what we are saying is that we also have a very strong evidence base around what does work to interrupt cycles of disadvantage and reoffending. And that's where we're really focused, is on what that alternative picture actually looks like. So that question of, well, if not prison, then what? Being able to make sure that when we've created the appetite, and that is, there's a different version of that into every state and territory, but when we've created that appetite, that we can work with decision makers and we can work with communities and we can work with government to say, well, this is what it could look like. This is what a different first responder model looks like. This is what a different alternative court process looks like. This is what things could look like instead of incarceration. This is what therapeutic detainment might look like. This is what things might look like at the point of post-release. We have all of that. It is around creating that appetite for change.
And I might turn to Ivan at this point, because Ivan, you've been involved in a lot of that program work. You've developed programs for prisoners and post-release programs, men's behaviour change programs. What do you see as the role and the potential that the programs in this space can bring?
Thanks, Erin, and thank you for your expressions as well, Mindy. The potential for community to be involved in the justice system at that grassroots level is warranted. We had a well-constructed society for tens of thousands of years here, where members of that society and those communities made the laws around what would happen in relation to any breaches of the community norms and requirements. And the imposing of a construct where it was a hierarchical construct on us as a people and didn't incorporate or include us into the upholding of a law that wasn't our law and ways that weren't our ways is warranted, it's needed. We have Aboriginal men and women and families and communities who just don't understand what this concept of law is and how it's implemented, how it's regulated, and what the punishments really are. So involving community members in the role of supporting both understanding but also supporting what punishment looks like. Quite often when a man or a woman or a child is locked up, the family's punished. And in an Aboriginal community, that's especially so. And not just Aboriginal communities, it's all our society. It is so that the removal of a member of a family punishes the family. And the person who's incarcerated or removed is then channeled away and often further traumatised and isolated from the very means of support that can assist and help that change. So the need for interventions that involve both community but also the demographics within the community, so women for women, men for men, and youth and young people, and families in particular for youth and young people, is warranted. And that should extend out to the greater community as well. I've often expressed that we live in communities, any one of the Western communities that you go to, Aboriginal communities and non-Aboriginal people live quite harmoniously together, and for all other cultures that come into those communities. There is still quite a lot of racism and discrimination that happens within those communities, but they're very quickly addressed by the communities. So I think it is that our communities don't particularly want to see a young person or any person removed from the community. They actually want to see them supported to change. If you've gone to school with a young person, grown up into middle ages with that person, you know them, having them removed from your community doesn't make the community safer. It just makes it one less person who can be involved in that community. So supporting the community to have, empowering the community to have greater voice and greater empowerment to be able to address the issues of crime and justice that's warranted or needed within that community will go a long way towards minimising the engagement with the actual system itself. I work with Aboriginal men, that's my specialty, and so many of the Aboriginal men who I know who've done programs that, not just myself, that other men like Ken Zumalovsky have created, where it gives them a chance to look at their experiences of trauma and support them to heal, means that those men change their lives, and in doing so, they change the direction of their family, they change the direction of their community, and those programs are paramount to getting interventions that take men, and in particular First Nations men, out of the justice system.
I'm going to turn to you now, Jonathon. We've had a new government elected just recently. You're leading, your organisation, PIAC, is leading a lot of justice advocacy work in criminal justice and more broadly in New South Wales. You're specifically partnering with PRF on the Raise the Age campaign. What do you see as the opportunities that a new government in New South Wales brings for an organisation like yours and your aims?
Yeah, look, I think it's a new government which will hopefully maintain this sense of slightly different politics and less partisan politics, or less personal politics. And we've seen an election campaign that was marked by this sort of lack of muckraking and sledging. And so I think around an issue like raising the age of criminal responsibility, I think we've got, if you like, a soft consensus. So people have been saying to us, yes, we support that, let's come back to it after the election, I think on both sides. So I think there's an opportunity there for us to build that soft consensus into a hard one, and also to try to maintain that sense of working across Parliament on something that should be a bipartisan issue around something like Raise the Age. And I'm interested to see how that translates to other areas. One of the things that I think is really worth us thinking about and keeping our eye on in justice reform with a new government, or just generally, is not just replacing bad old policy settings with new policy settings, but actually thinking of totally different ways of doing things. And the Closing the Gap framework in New South Wales is one that I desperately hope the new government will continue, because one of the priorities there was shared decision making with Aboriginal people and organisations, and around building the strength of Aboriginal community controlled organisations. Now that's when we start thinking totally differently about how we set policy, not just what the policy is, but actually, because we can replace it with a new set of policies, but when they don't work, what replaces it? If we actually start trying to think differently about our governance and how we I think that could be really interesting. I had a conversation with a colleague in Victoria who's working in government there, who said there is a really strong sense of not just the Aboriginal community as a stakeholder, but as a sovereign. So there's actually this sense of government deals with First Peoples there and their assembly there as a body that you deal with on a level of sovereign, and that to me was quite exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing that in some of their justice policies. So I don't want to over-egg it, but I think we need to be thinking big about those things, and it's the perennial challenge for our organisations: is how much little progressive, change do we bank, because we've got governments that may not have the confidence to go big. But if we bank too much of the little stuff, we miss the chance to think big. And I think that's where I think we should make sure we're always looking for those opportunities.
And Mindy, from a national perspective, Raise the Age has gained some really exciting prominence, I suppose, in the last 12 months. We've seen movement in the NT, we've got promising signs in the ACT as well. I mean, there is the Raise the Age campaign specifically, but do you see ripple effects from that campaign that kind of lead to potential other opportunities across the country?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess that one of the things that I've reflected on a bit over the last couple of years is, you know, in the justice reform space, we tend to be quite fixated on legislative reform, partly because there's heaps of excellent lawyers, you know, like these guys, kind of leading the way, and we absolutely need to be. So things like Raise the Age are obviously critically important, same as bail reform, ending mandatory sentencing. But I guess that what is also very clear, and I guess, you know, for people like Ivan and others in this room, I know that have worked in communities so much and that are working in service delivery, is that the legislative shift is quite a small part, really, of a much bigger issue. So raising the age is absolutely critical. It's critical symbolically, and it's critical, you know, for a whole range of reasons. But it absolutely needs, I think, for all of us to open up that question of, again, if not prison, then what? Because we know that we're imprisoning children who are incredibly vulnerable and disadvantaged. So what is it that we should or could be doing in the community instead of that? So yeah, as part of that Raise the Age conversation, I think that for people, you know, that are campaigning around that, there really is that question, and I guess the ACT government have done this sort of quite substantially, where they've looked at, well, what does happen for kids who are coming into contact with the justice system in the ACT? I think we need to see that in every state and territory. At the moment, it's very fragmented, so the mapping of what is available for children at the point of police. So what happens if police do pick up somebody who's acting out and who is perhaps a risk to the community or to themselves? Like what could we or should we be doing instead of putting that young person in a police cell? And then, you know, what are the supports that are actually available, that are 24 hours, that are culturally relevant, that are meaningful for children? So I think that when, in the same breath as talking about any kind of legislative change, we have to be talking about that social policy change and that welfare reform as well. Homelessness, raising the rate of social security, you know, these bigger picture campaigns are very much part of kind of justice campaigning, because we know at the moment, we can see, and I know there's people from Weave and CRC and lots of other amazing services that have really solid evaluations around the outcomes of those services. So we know that people that engage in particular programs have a much lower rate of reoffending or of going back into prison. But what we also know is that those services are funded to deal with a fraction of the people, of that 60,000 people coming out of custody, of those 8,000 children. Most people aren't touching a service that actually makes a difference. So we, I guess, again, raising the age is critical, but we do need, as Jonathon was saying, we need to think much bigger. We need to think about, what does a service system or a community look like where, yes, there's legislative shifts that means that, you know, people aren't in prison on stupid things and aren't there for short times and aren't there for bail breaches and aren't there when they're really young children. But what could or should governments be funding that would actually make a systemic difference in terms of the numbers of people in prison? So if we know that, say, people that touch a CRC service have a 70% reduction in terms of their likelihood to go back to prison, but they only work with 500 people a year and there's 20,000 people coming out of prison each year in New South Wales, what might it look like if every single person in New South Wales prisons had access to something like that if they wanted it? And that's the scale that we need to be thinking about. So although there's amazing, you know, we should absolutely be applauding the investment that does occur, and often it is, you know, we get very excited when a few $100,000 is spent on a program somewhere, and we should. But in terms of our campaign heads, I think we do need to start thinking about, what would it look like if every single person had access to alcohol and other drug treatment that they needed? What would it look like if every single person in the justice system had access to mental health support or disability support or First Nations support that is meaningful? Because that's when we'll see the structural change, I think, and when we need the legislative shift to move us along, but that's where our thinking, I think, needs to be.
Here.
Question for you, Ivan, around incorporating lived experience and lived experience of incarceration in the advocacy that we're doing. How important is it to centre those voices, and can we be doing it better?
Oh, very much so. I think we've only just touched the tip of an iceberg in regards to taking advantage of the lived experience. I facilitated a series of workshops for New South Wales Health Education Centre Against Violence, which was the original Strong Aboriginal Men's program. And we found that when we went into communities and we were running facilitating the programs within those communities, and it was the focus of that was on domestic family violence and child sexual assault, but also supporting healthy changes within the community from a men's perspective. What we observed that when we had men that came into the workshops who'd been into the justice system, I've never ever had a guy who came in and said what a great experience it was, how wonderful, I can't wait to break the law to go back there and do it again. And I strongly support everybody here to take an opportunity to do it. Sadly, majority of those men were going to be ending up in the justice system anyway by virtue of the colour of their skin. And the way that the law is constructed and then enforced, and also that it's policing sadly is a racist institute. But those men would come in and speak about their negative experiences, about the shortfalls of the system and how harmful it was to their mental health, their emotional health, their spiritual health and well-being, and how often it just created more criminals and isolated them from their families, and then to remove that tag of being a convict or a person who's been in jail became quite a long battle for a lot of these men. The profiling by the local police at every time they were walking down the street. And some of the men spoke about to the younger men and other men within the workshops that this is what you can expect when you go into that system. A continued harassment and profiling by police, a continued expectation that you are less than a human being, you aren't worthy of housing, you aren't worthy of a job or employment. And one of the focuses of our workshop was to support the Aboriginal men to understand that they're not bad men, they're traumatised men as a result of colonisation and the constructs of colonisation, and supporting the men to find a space of belonging in identity that made them feel empowered. So when we have men who work in the systems who've had the experience, the lived experience, and they're able to support and work with anyone that's coming in. I speak only for men because that's who I specialise working with. Those men, we see the value of change, we see the value of experience, we see the value of lived experience that ultimately results in greater depth of what this experience can be and is often like. We have a number of men who have, we've got men who are in leadership roles now with the Bennelong Aboriginal Men's Council that I facilitate on behalf of Department of Community and Justice. And 3 of those men have been incarcerated, had spent periods of time in jail for behaviour that they did as young traumatised men. And through support of older Aboriginal men, and oddly enough, this is a cultural process. Older men in our culture, older Aboriginal men take the young Aboriginal men and they teach them how to be men. And we now incorporate older men taking younger Aboriginal men and talking to them about what the constructs of jail are and how to be away from that, come away from that or stay out of that. I did a workshop down in the South Coast. It was the second Strong Aboriginal Men's workshop we did for the Education Centre Against Violence. We had 5 young men who were sitting around just talking about what they wanted to be when they grow up. And every one of them talked about which jail they were going to go to, like they had a choice, because they knew nothing better. And one of the young men said, I'm going to Goulburn, that's a hard jail, that's where my dad went to jail, I'm going to go to Goulburn. And I had to sit down for hours and hours and hours and explain to these young men that you surrender your freedom, you surrender everything, your identity, you become classified as a convict, as a criminal, and that stays with you for years and years and years. You don't get to have the freedom of choice that you have outside of that. And it led to me to unpack how much those young men actually know about justice and about the law and the legal system. And in the 30 plus communities that followed that particular community, we started asking men in those community, how much do you know about the law and the justice system and the processes? And it wasn't just that particular part of government that they didn't understand and know. It became the whole of government: housing, welfare, education, health and justice. And they had no idea about these constructs because we weren't included in the construct of them from the very get-go. We were immersed in them and expected to catch up and know what everybody else knew when they weren't a part of our lives. So having men who come in with lived experience, and women as well, I have no doubt, and sharing their experiences with those persons who are involved, that is only going to support the person who's immersed in that system, who's struggling with it, to better understand how challenging and difficult this can make their lives and how harmful it can be to themselves and their families, and to support them to find the ways to get out of that system and to find a better way of dealing with the issues that they have that are presenting. And quite often, and it goes without saying, for Aboriginal people, that issue is trauma. It's across every Aboriginal community that I've been to, every Aboriginal person, the lived experience of trauma of colonisation and being immersed in a system that is not our system, and not having the involvement in determining how that system is constructed to oversee the well-being of our communities, our families and our society as a whole.
A question for the panel now. Another area that the Foundation works in is domestic and family violence. And when working in criminal justice advocacy and trying to reduce incarceration and criminalisation, there can be a fine line to tread around defending the rights of the criminalised while also respecting the position of victims of crime. How, as advocates, do we sensitively and respectfully walk that line?
I mean, we need to start by building those bridges and talking to and including people from across the spectrum with a range of different experiences, so that we understand and we can have a genuine, find that common ground. I mean, the common ground around the issues we're talking about is community safety. Like and I think, most victims don't want it to happen to someone else. They don't want it to happen to them again. They don't want it to happen to their family. And that's common ground that we've got. So I think we need to be building those bridges, listening closely, and finding that common ground. I think that's where I start anyway. Yeah,
and I think that I just absolutely agree, and would add to that obviously, anybody that's worked for a minute in this sector knows that distinction between victim and offender is not such a clear-cut one, and so this idea that there's these two separate groups that have two separate sort of series of rights that exist somehow in opposition is something that, I think when we're working in this space, we need to think about. Obviously, if I'm doing Sunrise, that's probably not the messaging that I'm going to, be using. But I think exactly what Jonathon said. There's very few people that say, we don't want a safer community, and, so we always have to use that as a starting point. But I think that, thinking about, say, the work that Ivan does and thinking about programs or men's behavioural change programs, or thinking about those, and Claude and, others in this room that I can see that are absolutely embedded in the work of working with men, and primarily sort of in response to gendered violence, is absolutely part of what we need to start thinking about in terms of our response. So we know that prison doesn't work to make men less violent. Like, that is, again, there's very clear research about that, with some, some exceptional sort of programs here and there which have made a difference that are little and therapeutic. But we can, and I think that we also need to think about the pragmatic kind of question of what it is that actually works. So it's very tempting to, it's an incredibly heated area of social policy, and it's one of the ones I think that we're all kind of looking, we look nervous when we have to answer questions about it, because of course nobody wants to be suggesting that, violence against women's, great. And I'm just suddenly thinking you could just edit that bit, whoever's filming it. My life is, and we're done. Anyway. But we know that there are actually alternatives and evidence-based alternatives that make a difference in terms of both reducing violence and building community safety. And I would say also, and I know like people from the Miranda Project will talk to this in much more detail, but certainly in a lot of the communities that I've worked in and with a lot of the women that I've worked in that have also been criminalised and been victims of domestic violence, there's a lot of victims that don't see jail as being the answer as well. So I think that we need to not lump all victims of crime into, I guess, the sort of the way that we're often thinking about victims of crime is very much influenced by what we listen to on talkback radio or what we see on TV. And I think the victims are not a homogenous group, and there is, there's a great deal of difference in terms of what victims actually want.
And we also do need to recognise that people are justified in being angry.
Yeah.
They are perfectly justified in being angry, and we need that to make sure that we're validating that. We're not trying to kind of deflect and say, yes, but what about the solutions? I think people need to feel heard, and they have lived experience that we need to take really seriously, and they need to feel that they've got a stake in it with us as those who want to be making change, because otherwise I think we're just going to be at loggerheads.
Yep. Absolutely, I fully agree with that. Including, from a counsellor perspective, therapist perspective, is that if I'm working with a family where there's domestic violence, I'm asking them as two people sitting at a table, how do you want the change to happen, and what does that look like? So it becomes a conversation. We see domestic violence and also family violence labelled on the news. We see the perpetrator often vilified as being this or this or this, and it's very easy to jump on the back of that and remove the fact that this is a human being, this is a man with a story, and in that story you'll often see failings and shortfalls in his nurturing and support to grow into a healthy man, or a man who's well adjusted to the society or to the environment that he's put into. So when we're able to better work with our men in communities or the persons who are perpetrating the harm and understand what their stories are, we're better able to then offer support to both parties. So as I said before, Aboriginal men are not bad men, but we keep getting labelled as being bad men and get locked up just because we are vilified by society in so many different ways. When we look at perpetrators of domestic violence, a man who's violent towards a woman is yes, that is not acceptable. But if we don't work with that man to help him to change his behaviours and to understand what's going on for him as to why he's making the choices to use violence, then and if we just lock him away, all we've done is put the problem over there for this amount of time. And he comes out, and we've seen it happen time and time again. The man goes into another relation and it gets perpetrated again, or it gets perpetuated. That has to stop. It does not work. It hasn't worked, and it's not going to work. When we worked at healing and supporting growth and change and supporting community to support that growth and change, whether it's at a micro level or at a macro level, we will see healthier changes and outcomes in relation to domestic family violence. We also got to understand and appreciate that we're a country that's built on the disempowerment and the oppression of women. I sit here this afternoon and I'm looking out there and I can see 4 men in the audience, and you're here to have these really in-depth and empowering conversations to understand and appreciate about the advocacy construct in relation to justice. And where are our men that should be sitting in here having these conversations? Where are those men who should be sitting in here? And quite often we see our politicians who, and I appreciate that it's a new government that's just been elected and there's a lot of work to be done. But these conversations are paramount for us to be having with them to say we're a community and we don't want to lock our men up just because of the one bad thing that they've done. Now, it's a terrible thing, domestic violence. I know it as a lived experience. But for me, my father was a violent man and my foster father was a violent man. And I didn't stop loving him because of that one thing. I didn't dislove him at all, and didn't stop loving him at all. I loved him, and I wanted him to be the best that he can be. I wanted him in my life. And if he was removed from me, then it was just punishing me. I became a broken person then, and I was left to my own devices around trying to find a way to become a man in my own world, without that father figure there. No man is the sum of the worst thing that he ever perpetrates or commits. And he's so much more. And we forget that those men who are the violent perpetrators, they're also uncles, they're grandfathers, they're brothers, they're mechanics, they're shopkeepers, they're politicians, they're judges and they're lawyers. And they are so much more than just the one thing. So we need to stop labelling it so poorly, and I think we need to start having more communal conversation as to how we support the whole of our society, the whole of our community, and in particular the family unit around resolving the issues of the unwellness of a member of that particular family. I know that's a long-winded expression and answer, but I think the answer truly lies in bringing it back to the table, the old kitchen table where we sit around and we talk about how do we resolve this, but making sure that through our government and through the agencies that do the representation of the money that we as taxpayers make available, that money is put into supporting men's behaviour change, supporting programs, supporting healing programs, supporting drug and alcohol rehabilitation. And gambling, don't start me on gambling. What a horrendous outcome. If our government wasn't addicted to gambling, we'd have a healthier society. I can only imagine how many men and women who will go home today after spending their pay packet, and it's payday today, for a lot of people who will go home and there's going to be violence in the family because of poker machines in pubs. And that in itself is an issue. So the way we construct our society, but how we offer the support back to those families within our society is absolutely paramount to addressing the issue of domestic family violence.
Another question for the panel, and we've heard just then from Ivan about the importance of having the government on board, but I think we all recognise that in this space we all need to be collaborating in order to get the solutions that we desire. And I think Mindy was saying over lunch that often when she has conversations, she finds that a lot of key people are in agreement on the solutions, but the politics can stand in the way. So many people are working towards the same goal. We have incredible NGOs, we have incredible colleagues and allies in government. We have funders with the same goals trying to support this work. How can we in the room, I suppose, collaborate better to get those results that we're after?
If people haven't seen, there's a KPMG document, Unlocking the Power of Partnership, I think it's called, and it talks about the shift from transactional to transformative work. And that's got some of what I find to be some of the best guidance on thinking through how to partner well. And I'd love to say that I did everything in it every time, and I don't. There are two challenges, I think, if I can not pretend I've got the answers, but two challenges I see. And the first is how do we work with urgency but not haste? So I was discussing a law reform issue with a colleague at another organisation recently, and the response was, right, we know what to do. I'll go away and I'll draw up the asks and then we can get people to sign on. And I was like, no, well, why don't we get everyone together first and let's figure out if there's consensus, if there's disagreement, what that might look like. And then everyone's got skin in the game and it's something we'll genuinely co-design, and then we can support a plan of action going forward. We might think we know the answer. So there's this tendency, because the problems are urgent, to move with haste, which I think is undermining that capacity for real coalition building and doing things differently. So that's the first challenge. The second big challenge is just around capacity. So, at PIAC, we've got now about 50 staff. So we're reasonably large for a community legal centre and an NGO working on advocacy issues. We're often working, for example, on the NDIS with disability rights advocates and disability rights organisations. And they've often got one policy person or one part-time policy person or one policy person who can do a bit of NDIS because other people are doing other things. Then that person leaves. And so that capacity for long-term systemic advocacy is really skinny. And so I think for bigger organisations, and particularly the big NGOs, there's a responsibility on us to think about how do we hold that space. So that's something we try to do at PIAC, is how do we hold this space so that we can keep an issue going over years and years. And we've got a few more people, so if one person leaves, we haven't lost the whole all of the thinking behind it and all of that knowledge, and we can sub people in and out a bit. So we need to think about how we can support a sector in which there's often just so little capacity, and it's the same often in First Nations groups. We're just absolutely struggling, particularly when you're dealing with reactive things the whole time. To have that time for the systemic is really hard, and so I think that's a challenge that we need to step up to, is finding ways to hold the space.
And I think that I'd agree with all of that, and I haven't read the KPMG report, but one of the things that I also, so that kind of tension between having kind of a thoughtful strategic approach in terms of what you want to achieve and how you want to bring about change, at the same time as recognising that there are moments that where you absolutely need to stop what you were planning to do that day and step into a particular space. I think so. That I think is really critical, and then how to do that in a way that's consultative, that's respectful, that's bringing a broad coalition in. I think that is an ongoing challenge. I guess that what I often am saying to my staff is that, say something like youth justice, like it is a crisis, regardless of whether or not the newspaper is reporting on it or not. So what is happening today in Banksia, in Ashley, in all of them, all of Cleveland, all of the, like, it is an absolute crisis, and we are going to be absolutely horrified that we treated children that way. Whether or not that's in the paper should not necessarily be the thing that kind of prompts us to decide what we're going to do about that particular issue. So I think that recognising the difference between crisis and sort of that longer term strategy. I guess the other thing that I would say is that I think sometimes in the justice advocacy space, there's a lot of agreement around, we need to get people out of prison. There's often quite different ideas about what the strategies might look like to do that. And I think that's a really good thing, right? Like, I think that's a really important thing, that there's lots of different campaigners that have different ideas around how they might bring something about. I think being a bit brave and talking about that and disagreeing with each other sometimes would be really good in this space. I don't think we do a lot of it. Compared to, like, my partner works in energy policy, they're just at each other all the time, like arguing, and it's so robust.
I can hear it over the partitions.
Yeah, right. But it's like, but I actually think that's a really healthy thing. So I don't want us to be argy-bargy all the time, but I do think, sometimes it really helps to have different opinions about how to get to a particular place, and we shouldn't necessarily see difference in that as being a problem. But I do think that as a new organisation kind of stepping into this space, obviously there's an enormous need also to be really mindful of who's been doing the work for a really long period of time, and most of the case in Australia, that is First Nations people and communities, decades and decades worth of that. And so regardless of how urgent something is, making sure that you're working in a respectful way, I think is really critical in terms of building legitimacy, but also making sure you get things right, because you want to talk to people that have been, that have had their heads in this and skin in the game for such a long time.
And before we hear from Ivan on this, I just wanted to give a warning that we're about to throw the panel open for questions from the audience. So have your question ready, and we'll hear from Ivan.
I agree with both my panel members that it has to come back to discussion, and we have to, I think, look at it from more from a community perspective. What can we do more of to affect the changes? If you look at the education, you'll have a P&C, the Parent and Teachers Association, and they come together regularly and they'll have discussions about what's going on in the school and how is education being implemented within that particular area of education, and what's lacking, what needs to be changed. I mean, there's no reason why we can't do that in law and justice. There's no reason why we can't do that in health. There's no reason why we can't do that in housing and that. We as community members have to be more involved in what's going on in our community. We can't keep this separation that happens where the law sits over there and the justice system sits over there, and we expect to be kept safe here. If we want safety, we have to play a role, and that role is really integral by way of we have to hold the people who are making the decisions to account. And that shouldn't happen every 4 years or when there's a by-election. It should happen on a regular occasion. And I know we tend to sit back now when we look at those protesters and people who are challenging and confronting things like climate change, or they're challenging and confronting a whole number of issues that are happening in our society, and we sit back in the comfort of our lounge and go, well, what are they going on about now? And it's like, well, no, they're voicing their want and need for change, and that is our right. That's our democratic right. And we can't sit back and expect the system to keep making the same mistakes that it's making and not be held to account by us. You know, of the thousands of Aboriginal people who are incarcerated in this state, a large population of them are my relatives. And I hold them to account when they come out. I say, pull your head in, stop it, change. What do you need to change? And I will help you get access to it. And if we as a society or communities start doing that at varied levels throughout our communities, then we can affect change. It's not just our family that we should be doing that with, it's our community. Because we live in this community, whether it's the inner west, whether it's Western New South Wales, whether it's the southern tablelands, whether it's the northern tablelands, whatever community people live in, that's your community. And we should have the right and the capacity to be able to be involved with the decision-making processes that results in the outcome of the well-being for our members of our community, but also the people who are having difficulty and challenges within our community. And that means that the agencies, such as the care agencies who are provided with our tax money to provide support and services, they should be held to account on a regular basis. So I love the idea of a P&C. I love the idea of it maybe being a justice P&C kind of construct, or a health construct, or a housing construct. But we need to be more involved at a communal level. In Aboriginal society, when pre-colonisation, what I do know happened was that the Elders Council and members of the community sat around and made determinations as to what the outcome would be of a behaviour that affected the whole community, whether it was an unhealthy relationship that was taking place, where somebody should not have been engaging with somebody else that they know that they weren't supposed to in the community, or whether there was a breach of the communal law. The decisions and determinations were made by a community. And that is what we as a society need to tend to steer back towards, because this one isn't working. The one that we've got is not working. And Aboriginal people really struggle to fit into this society, because we have it's our genetic construct that we as Aboriginal people live in a community, and we're not a part of this community, and that's why it's so hard for us to be in it.
Thanks, Simon. Any questions from the audience? Claude.
It should say building coalitions for radical change. Yeah, my name's Claude. I manage the Rainbow Lodge, and I work with men coming out of prison. 95% of them are perpetrators of domestic violence, 40 to 70% of First Nations men, 100% of mental health and drug and alcohol issues, and I have a lived experience of incarceration and drug addiction. It's a good point. I go to lots of these meetings, and big with DCJ, and I'm usually one, maybe 3 or 4 men in the room, And as Ivan says, Mike, how do we get across the solution to safer communities and a reduction in domestic violence is the man. We cannot build or police our way out of it with refuges for women escaping domestic violence. I've been in prison with enough men who are in prison for it, and they go in there is no programs, they come out more angry, more resentful, and the next victim is not aware of what's happened before. And we need to change. The only way we're going to get safer communities and reduce domestic violence is we need to empower and strengthen our men. And I look at women, you get breast cancer and women are on the street. The change in the funding that's got from breast cancer, prostate cancer kills heaps more men, but we're men as a society, we have an inability to speak up for ourselves and hold ourselves accountable and go, this is what we need. And I don't know how to do that, but that's what we need to do. Men need to be able to can you imagine if there was 10,000 men on the street saying domestic violence is unacceptable? There'd be change. I'm sorry, but women aren't going to change the domestic violence situation in this country. Only men can. Yeah. We need to hold them accountable. And I think one of the problems we have in this country is we don't accept how violent we are. You know, MMA, all that violence we see, like, I don't watch it. And I tell people, you know, I've got female friends, I say, if you support that and watching that, you're supporting men to become violent, because that's what that puts across. That if you're a man on steroids, that your manliness relates to how strong and big you are and how much you can hurt someone, you know. And we know that when men are damaged, they're the ones that destroy our communities. The women don't destroy our communities, the men do. So when we disempower them, all we do is set up our communities to be destroyed. And I just finish with this story because it's a friend of mine and it's so pertinent. His father, he came here as a migrant from India. His father was the chief pilot at Air India, trained RAF pilots during World War II, the top of his thing in India. He, you know, lived in a big house, servants. He came to Australia. They didn't recognise his qualifications. He drove a taxi, became an alcoholic. He bashed his kids and his wife. And, you know, my friend grew up seeing his father through the eyes of his mother as a bad, horrible man. He never knew that story. The story was never told in his house. And he went away and did a men's program, and they brought up that story, and he understood why his father was the man he was. You know, and I think that's what we need to look at if you're looking at the solutions to the problems without safer communities, because men are the perpetrators of all the violence, whether it's drug-related, domestic-related. We need to fix the men.
Thanks, Hord.
Thank you. Any other questions? This might be our final one. Ruth.
We knew this front table would probably be... We were worried about bread rolls being thrown.
Thanks to you all for a great panel, really interesting. A number of you have reflected on the way that the drivers of incarceration lie outside of the justice system, or what we understand to be justice agencies. And so in thinking about building coalitions for change, thinking about building solutions, we know that everyone in this room too, I guess, potentially connected with the Foundation's work around justice and safety. We know that a lot of government agencies have justice streams and agencies who are really engaged with all of these issues. Drivers lie outside of the justice system. How do we think about building coalitions with those who don't see engaging with people who've been in custody or criminalisation as their core business? So people working in health, in disability, housing, in government, in other organisations, in foundations, elsewhere. How do we think about coalitions across sectors, across disciplines, so everybody's engaged with this question about the damage that's caused by the justice system? It's not justice agencies' responsibilities, it's everybody's.
Can I respond to that? And I'll speak at the example that I put forward that we are currently working with a group of men who I spoke about earlier, called the Bennelong Aboriginal Men's Council. It's a collection of men who represent 8 communities from across the state. And there's 10 of us who come together quarterly. We're funded through DCJ. And the idea of this is about, we pay them for their time. They have paid jobs as well, and people say, oh, but they're double dipping. It's like, well, hold on a second. No, this is their community representation. That's their employment representation. So we pay them. We put money on the table and we say, no, we want you to do your community work, but we also want you to do your role in the community as a community member, come and give us input and insight as to what's going on there. So we pay for them to come and sit and to talk and to determine solutions. So money is a big factor. How do we get people involved in this? We start putting money on the table. Stop giving the money to the care agencies who built empires to do this. Like, they have failed time and time and time again. The disparity of Aboriginal people in communities across New South Wales is the same as what it was 30 years ago, and those agencies have built empires. So we're now putting the money back onto the ground for men to come and start having those conversations. So yes, there has to be a reward, there has to be support, there has to be process in place to assist in that. And for us, the way we do that is a financial reward and benefit. And we talk about the greater benefit will be a healthier community 5 years down the track. We will see less, we will see different policing in the communities because we'll hold everyone to account. We have a process called the 7-point plan. We create men's groups, women's groups, tribal councils. We evaluate the services, including the government services that are in the community, and we make determinations with them as to how they can better support the community. Not police, not punish, not hurt or harm, but to better support that community. And that means that some of the care agencies who've long been funded to deliver programs into those communities, they will be invited to leave those communities because they've failed in their obligation, much as we invite the politicians to have to step down every 4 years because they're getting their job reviewed. So that kind of process we know works, but it does require funding. If we channel the funding away from the care agencies and put them back into the community and put them on the ground and support the youth support services, we support the youth and young people, we support them, and we support when we know that we can create healthier communities. And the reason why we know that we can do that is because they take ownership of their community and what takes place within that community, what is allowable in that community. And that had been getting done for about, I think it's around 60,000 years, and it was proven to work.
Thank you. So can I just add
Yes,
to that?
ma'am.
Sort of, and I just wanted to talk about it from an advocacy perspective, because I love that sort of model on the ground. I think that thing of bringing people into this conversation is really critical. So one of the things that the Justice Reform Initiative is really strong on and is trying to build this supporter base. So we've got about 130 supporter organisations. If anyone has not signed up, then you should come and see me afterwards. I said that in a slightly threatening way. Hope you're frightened enough. But those organisations, of course, there's lots of people from the justice space in there, but there's also the AMA, I think I may have just got sort of the Australian Psychological Society to join up. A lot of homelessness peaks, AOD peaks for people with disabilities. So we absolutely need that groundswell at a community level so that there are people having those conversations. But I think the advocacy actually has to happen at a government level as well. So often, when we write letters to members of parliament, and we're writing letters to a lot of members of parliament and a lot of different portfolios, ministers with different portfolios and shadows, often our letters will get flicked to the Attorney General or to corrections. And actually that's not who we want to be speaking with. So I think in terms of our kind of strategic thinking around where the money should be situated in Parliament or in governments, we need to start thinking about money for breaking cycles of incarceration existing outside of the justice portfolios. So we need the other portfolios to sort of be stepping into that space, especially when it comes to communities, especially when it comes to housing and homelessness and health. I guess that from my perspective, a lot of the time it makes sense for that money to be held in places like Premier and Cabinet or in places like Treasury, where it really recognises that this is a whole of government issue. So we talk about whole of government all the time, but the money still goes to the justice agency. So I guess that I'd see that it's such an important point that we need the campaigning to be happening across a whole range of different sectors, but we also need the money to be situated in a way that really recognises that the answers don't exist in prisons. We don't want to, I know there's probably corrections staff here, but we don't want to be giving corrections money to people when we could be giving it to communities, when we could be doing a whole lot of things that actually have an evidence base in terms of what works.
Jonathon?
Maybe this is an obvious point, but I guess to be building those coalitions, we need to be thinking about what those different potential allies want to achieve and how they see things. So, health, may or may not be interested in reducing the number of people who go to prison, but so what are they interested in? How do these things align? So it may be that we can find a way to achieve the same thing. We had a roundtable about children and fines earlier this week, and one of the things we were talking about there was, and it was a point that came out of something that Peter McGillivray raised, and that is, if you're looking at an issue like the amount of kids that are getting fines for not having a ticket on the train, right? One answer to that is you reduce the amount of that they're being fined for that. Another answer is you let kids travel for free on the train, right? And that would be an amazing thing. That would be an amazing thing for so many reasons. And so how do we make the social case for that? Not because you care about kids getting fined, but because this would bring these other benefits. It would be a whole lot cheaper. You wouldn't have to have these transit police constantly checking everyone's. Like, there's a whole lot of reasons why this would be a great piece of government policy, but it's not because you feel sorry for kids in Mount Druitt getting tickets, because we may care about that, but a lot of people don't. So it is, as I say, it's probably an obvious point, but what matters to, and I think this is money for you is not a bad place to start. Like, always back self-interest. But that's the mindset we've got to get in and recognise that the things that we deeply care about are not things that everyone cares about. So what do they care about, and where's that common ground?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathon. We are at time, unfortunately, and I don't want to keep you any further because there's actually dessert, tea and coffee up at the back of the room, which you're welcome to join us in if you're able to stick around for a bit. Thank you all so much for coming and sharing in this conversation today. And a particular thanks to our panellists for the experience and the wisdom that they've shared with us today. Would you please join me in thanking Ivan, Clarke, Mindy, Sotiri and Jonathon Hunyor. Thanks very much, and I'll see you at the back for dessert.